Thank you all for showing up for another installment of the Distinguished Artist Series. We're really excited to have artist Noelle Mason here to join us today. We're just thrilled that you guys are coming out to these talks, these events. Noelle has shown nationally and internationally in galleries and institutions around the world, including the National Museum of Mexican Art, the Orlando Museum of Art, the Biography Museum in Athens, Greece, and the Whitney Museum of American Art. She is the recipient of a Joan Mitchell Foundation Artist Grant, a Jerome Fellowship, the Santo Foundation Individual Artist Grant, and the Florida Prize for Contemporary Art, the Southern Prize, and the Female in Focus Award from the British Journal of Photography. In 2004, Noelle was a resident at Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture. She received her MFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and currently holds the position of Associate Professor of Art at the University of South Florida. So please join me in welcoming Noelle Mason.
So I'm starting today with this still from a couple of stills from the film Videodrome by David Cronenberg. And I like to call this talk The Contract with the Screen. I think about the work that I'm making as a relationship or as a kind of like investigation of our relationship with screens in general and with our new kind of images that are made sort of instantaneously and arrive in our hands from the nether regions of the world in ways that have no real precedent in human history. So this film, if you've never seen it before, is a kind of great kind of musing on that from about now 40 years ago, I guess. So. So my work began as a question about the increasing mediation of social and political spaces through surveillance, dataveillance, and screen-based images, and how the screen's object silently shapes the content of our relationship with the images it flashes across our screens. Although I'm often critical of the interest in artist biography and the tendency to psychoanalyze artists and their work, I think that it is important to provide context for the work I'm about to show you. I'm going to give a general warning here that the work I'm about to show discusses violence, uses images that were part of news stories about violence, includes sexual violence and suicide. On July 17th, 1984, James Oliver Huberty called a mental health clinic requesting an appointment. He left his contact details with the receptionist and was assured at the clinic that they would get back to him soon. Unbeknown to Huberty, the receptionist had misspelled his name as Schuberty, and his call was logged as a non-crisis inquiry to be handled within 48 hours. The following morning, Wednesday, July 18th, Huberty took his wife and daughters to the San Diego Zoo. In the course of the walk, he told his wife that his life was effectively over, referring to the mental health clinic's failure to return his phone call the previous day. He said, "Society had their chance." After eating lunch at a McDonald's restaurant in the Claremont neighborhood of San Diego, the Hubertys then returned home. Shortly thereafter, he walked into his bedroom where his wife was laying. He leaned toward her and said, "I want to kiss you goodbye." She asked him where he was going, to which he replied, "I'm going human hunting." Carrying a bundle wrapped inside a checkered blanket, Huberty walked out of the door of his family's home, saying, "Goodbye, I won't be back." At approximately 3:56 p.m. on July 18th, Huberty drove his car into the parking lot of the McDonald's restaurant in San Ysidro, California. In his possession was a Browning semi-automatic pistol, a 9mm Uzi, a Winchester 12-gauge pump-action shotgun, hundreds of rounds of ammunition, and a radio. A total of 45 people were present inside the restaurant. He set the radio to a local music station, then opened fire. He shot 40 of the 45 people in the restaurant, killing 21 and injuring 19 before being shot by a police SWAT sniper. It was the deadliest mass killing in US history. Huberty had lost his job as a security guard the week prior and had a history of blaming his trouble with employment on Mexican immigration. 20 of the 21 killed were Mexican or Mexican Americans. I was 6 at the time of the massacre. My father had been called off to work, and I was taken to my grandmother's house watching the news unfold on live television. My mom and my grandparents were in disbelief that something of this nature could happen in our town, But my experience was different because my father, a member of the San Diego Police Department and a SWAT sniper, was part of the team handling the event. My interest in what unfolded on TV that day had little to do with the tragedy and was entirely shaped by the possibility that I could see my dad on television. The power of the medium and the desire that it provoked in me had entirely erased the actuality of the event that unfolded on the screen. I was experiencing an acute version of what Guy Debord in 1967 called the Society of the Spectacle, a society where social relationships are mediated by images. In watching the news that day, I saw a screen that showed me my own desires. The McDonald's massacre held within it issues that would reoccur over and over in my work. School shootings, white nationalism, surveillance, the US-Mexico border, policing, alienation, mental health, the power of sight, and how all of these are wrapped up in the blind spots of vision. In societies where modern conditions of production prevail, all of life presents itself as an immense accumulation of spectacles. Everything that was directly lived has moved away into representation. My work delves into the simulacra that Debord describes here and the complex relationship between the way we process screen-based images and our inability to deal with their immateriality and the alienation of our technologized selves. Can formal changes alter the way we experience images so that the medium aids in processing their content? This question identifies a central concern in the field of sculpture, that of medium transformation, and led me to begin remediating images from digital to analog with varying degrees of manipulation. I use remediation to translate an image into a tangible object to destabilize the viewer's relationship with the flatness of the image. This process adds concrete tactility to an otherwise transient and immaterial image. Sometimes this change is subtle, a copy of a digital image replicated in counter cross-stitch or cyanotype. Other times, an image or detail is expanded into a room-sized installation. In 2004, this image was one of the 1,500 or so leaked from the Abu Ghraib prison. The images depicted Iraqi prisoners, many of whom were never charged with any crime, being subjected to humiliation as well as physical, psychological, and sexual torture by American soldiers and intelligence officers. The conversation surrounding these images at the time was that these crimes were perpetuated by individual bad apples, which we now know through declassified documents that in fact, this type of physical and psychological torture was being perpetrated with the endorsement of the Bush administration in direct violation of the Geneva Convention. These images testified to an abuse of power on the part of the American government and reminded me of experiments from the 60s and 70s, which were developed to study the effect of institutional fictions on subjects within their systems. In the 1970s, the Stanford Psychology Department conducted a prison experiment to test the effects of context on otherwise normal individuals. The volunteers were tested for mental fitness, then arbitrarily split into two groups, guards and prisoners. Each prisoner was arrested and taken to a makeshift prison in the Stanford basement. The guards were given a set of instructions on how to govern their fellow students. The planned 2-week investigation into the psychology of prison life had to be ended prematurely after only 6 days because of what the situation was doing to the students who participated. In only a few days, the guards became sadistic and the prisoners became depressed, rioted, and showed signs of extreme stress and antisocial behavior. The prisoners even nicknamed the most brutal guard in the study John Wayne because of his macho cowboy image and impunity of using camp inmates. In the 1960s, Stanley Milgram conducted a series of social psychology experiments which measured the willingness of study participants to obey an authority figure who instructed them to perform acts that conflicted with their personal conscience. Although the experiment was very flawed, its conclusion suggested that ordinary people, simply doing their jobs and without any particular hostility on their part, could become agents in a terrible destructive process, and that relatively few people have the resources needed to resist authority. In direct response to the Abu Ghraib images, I made the work mise en scene. Mise en scene is a term used in film to describe the intentional composition of different elements of the film, such as sets, props, actors, costumes, and lighting to portray meaning and mood. I'm gonna play the video. We don't have sound, So I'll just kind of narrate what's going on. So this work is essentially an 8-foot by 8-foot cube. Is that playing? Did I stop it accidentally? It's not letting me fast forward. I will just let it play, and I'll talk over it. So it's an 8-foot by 8-foot room with a monitor on each side of the room. Inside is, underneath the monitor, there's a video game button. And inside the room, it's dark. And I am inside. They're connected to 4 sets of electrodes. When the viewer arrives in this space, essentially there's no indication as to what's going to happen if they press the button. They're seeing a night vision image, so they see it in infrared, essentially through the video camera, the CCTV video camera. When they press the button, it turns a light on inside of the box, so it changes the CCTV from night vision to color. And it also sends electric shocks to one of my 4 limbs. So each side of the box controls a different limb. So I was interested in like essentially taking these images that I saw coming from Abu Ghraib and translating them in a way that wasn't direct, but takes cues from those images and mixes them with a sort of language of video games as well as scientific experiment. The experiment specifically that I just detailed, to create a scenario that attached the idea of seeing or seeing better to the relationship of like the one doing the kind of violence or torture. So mise-en-scene appropriates the language of minimalism, video games, scientific experiments, penal architecture, and surveillance to talk about the intimate connection between the military and entertainment industries and examine how mediation functions both to facilitate acts of violence and to uphold the assertion of boundaries between cultural and political institutions of power. The seductive quality of surveillance is synthesized with gallery mores and interface transparency, and it makes the viewer at the institution and the artist equal participants in the creation of a scene, making passive viewership impossible. The dialogue around vision and visibility is most often shaped by discourses of power, but this discourse is one which I have become less sanguine about. There is no doubt that vision and power have a connection that contemporary society makes manifest, but the ways in which vision is constructed by the subtle relations of objects is a less prominent and to me more interesting area in which to develop my work. In many ways, mise-en-scene marked a turning point in the way I think through my work, and this revolves around the 2 uses of the word gaze. The first use of the word gaze is probably most familiar and is associated with Jean-Paul Sartre, Michel Foucault, and Laura Mulvey. In this understanding, gaze is synonymous with the act of looking at the other and creates a subjective power difference. The one looking feels a sense of power over the one being looked at. Foucault's 1975 book, Discipline and Punish, explores the modifying power of this type of looking. Foucault used the panopticon prison designed by Jeremy Bentham, seen here, to illustrate the power a guard's look can have on a prisoner. He describes the prisoner of a panopticon as being at the receiving end of an asymmetrical surveillance system. He is seen, but he does not see. He is an object of information, never a subject of communication. As a consequence, the inmate polices himself for fear of punishment. This is distinct from the gaze that was developed by Jacques Lacan. The gaze for Lacan is the name given to the object's cause of desire. The gaze is what takes into account our desire and distinguishes the apparatus of sight from vision. Vision is distinguished from bare sight by how our desire shapes what we see. The gaze is the name for the mysterious quantity that provokes us to look at something, that draws our attention to it. It is often referred to as a stain in the visual field and is similar to what Barth calls the punctum, the thing that pricks us when we look at a photograph. Although the gaze is always present in something we desire to look at, certain works of art can give us an experience with the gaze, a feeling of non-mastery over the visual field, while other works function to maintain a safe distance from it. The experience of the gaze that Lacan describes is one of disturbance. It is a feeling that the object stares back at us. Gaze for Lacan describes a lack of mastery over our visual field, in direct contrast to the look that is described by Foucault. The difference is important in understanding the way in which I am collapsing the distance between the object and subject in my work. In this work, as well as much of my other work, I'm preoccupied with an interest in adding a third or fourth dimension to two-dimensional images. Sometimes this change is a subtle change of medium, and other times an image becomes a fully immersive environment. Sometimes I'm interested in the faithful reproduction of images, and other times I allow my own fictions to creep in. The shift in medium is an attempt to produce a fracture or fissure which allows the viewer's subjective position to become evident. What is our relationship to the content of images outside of the screen itself? And how do image machines reinforce psychological borders imposed to police the boundaries of race, class, and nationality? Through remediation, is it possible to change the content of images, and how far? These are the questions that led me to begin remediating images, or translating images from a digital to analog format with varying degrees of manipulation. The early mid to late 2000s was inundated with a series of beheading videos released as propaganda to terrorize those considered an enemy of Al-Qaeda and later ISIS. For some, these videos are impossible to watch, and for some, they were collected and traded. The morality of whether or not to watch the videos was highly contested, with some saying that it could cause irreparable harm to the viewer and disrespect to the family of the victim. I've considered it in a way part of my job to understand how these videos function. I wondered if it was possible to translate them into a medium which could render them as a more absorbable, to create a work that would allow the audience a space of contemplation and to act as a witness, but without the pornographic excess of the visual. This led to a body of work called sonata. The word sonata literally translates into sounded and means a piece of instrumental music, which is the opposite of a cantata, which is sung. In these works, I remediate the audio files associated with several of the beheading videos, running them through transcription software to create a score that is then cut into calf hide vellum and displayed on a series of music stands. The scores are then played by wind instruments in both live performances and as sound installation, rendering the video into an auditory experience that is contemplative, emotional, and abstract, but concrete. Let's see if this plays. We'll just try some of these out and see if it does not. You're saving 3 minutes of your life. Anyway, there's a kind of music concrete sound score that's created from these that offers a place for kind of thinking about these videos without looking at them. What time are we going until? Just okay. This time's correct right now. All right. So my work is in many ways about the contradiction within American mythology. The American dream of rugged individualism and self-reliance blinds us to the necessary interconnectedness of our lives. The liberal fantasy of personal freedom, individual responsibility, and negative rights has generated a culture of alienation which leads to excessive and often violent symptoms that are increasingly experienced as social phenomenon mediated by screen-based images. Thoreau is best known for his book Walden, which is a reflection upon simple living embodied by American self-reliance. He was also well known for his essay Civil Disobedience, which detailed an argument for disobedience to an unjust state. In 2006, I was invited to build a work at the Franconia Sculpture Park in rural Minnesota. Wanting to make a work that responded to the rural location and culture of the sculpture park, I began to think about Thoreau. Over 100 years later, 100 years after Thoreau, the house on 100 years after the house on Walden Pond was the inspiration for the house built in Montana by a different famous American survivalist and essayist. This is the house of Theodore Kaczynski, otherwise known as the Unabomber. Through the 80s and 90s, Kaczynski targeted airlines and university professors who he saw as promoting technological advancement. His anti-technology manifesto, Industrial Society and Its Future, was published in the New York Times in 1995, which ultimately led to his arrest. I was interested in how Henry David Thoreau's relatively passive ideologies of self-reliance and civil disobedience had been twisted to produce the violent ideologies which inspired the Unabomber, and subsequently a fringe online following of Kaczynski-inspired primitists who ironically spend hours on the internet, most likely in their parents' suburban basement, sharing memes that call for the destruction of modern civilization. Thinking about the self-imposed isolation of both Thoreau and Kaczynski and the situational isolation of the American suburbs, I decided to build my own version of the house on Walden Pond. I contacted the Walden Society and got a set of blueprints for the house. However, instead of wood and natural materials, my house would be made from the vinyl used to produce McMansions. The house would also be built omitting both doors and windows. The interior of the house was finished with freshly painted drywall, wood laminate floor, track lighting, and 4 surveillance cameras. The other artists at the residency were invited to be sealed inside the house with me, with a carton of Marlboro cigarettes, old-style beer, Miller High Life beer, 2 hatchets, and a chainsaw. This also has sound, but we're not going to hear it. So I'll play some of it and then move on. Oh, there's subtitles. Wait, what did I just do? Okay. No, what's happening on my end here? There's some things happening. Oh, it's narrating. Got it. Interesting. We might have to deal with that for the rest of the time. Good for anyone who's hard of hearing in the audience. But all right. So seem to be allowed to skip around on this one. So I'll go ahead and do so. Do you know how to get rid of the subtitles? Oh yeah, there you go. That works. It's okay. It's all right. Anyhow, so essentially, like, we were all put inside this, and then the roof was sealed. And over the course of about 4 hours, spent the time first kind of playing a game of like hatchet throwing that then became later just trying to get out. That was yeah, the chainsaw, there was a chainsaw in there, just in case. Good thing, too, it would have taken us a lot longer to get out had we not had the chainsaw. And then it was recorded on 4 surveillance cameras as well. All right, so through this bacchanalian performance, we broke our way out of the house. The resulting sculpture was called Cul-de-sac, an experiment in living well, and was created to render farcical the romantic individualism that is present in Thoreau, Kaczynski, and suburbia alike. The vinyl siding remained pristine on the outside while the interior continued to decay. From 2014 to 2017, the work was transformed into a self-sufficient tiny house by the site manager for Franconia Sculpture Park. The desire for efficiency, independence, and response to untenable economic conditions, the tiny house movement has gained traction for much the same reason Thoreau built his house on Walden Pond. As E.B. White stated about Thoreau, Henry went forth to battle when he took to the woods, and Walden is the report of a man torn by two powerful and opposing drives, the desire to enjoy the world and the urge to set the world straight. The completion of the piece was the sale of the house in 2019. It was sold for $25.13, the same amount that Henry David Thoreau had spent on his house on Walden Pond. That's there the tiny house lives. It was moved off the property and onto private land in St. Croix Falls, Wisconsin, becoming the permanent residence of former Franconia Sculpture Park manager Paul Howe. In an age of electronic information transfer, when the documentation of an event is simultaneous to the event itself, our access to events is highly mediated, and what we see on television is filtered through the desires of state and corporate influences. On April 20th, 1999, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold murdered 12 students and one teacher at the Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado. This event became an iconic touchstone of high school shootings, foreshadowing many of the issues we are dealing with today, including toxic masculinity, the rise of alt-right internet media, and homegrown white nationalist terrorism. The body of work, Boys on Film, delves into this feedback loop of fiction and fantasy that contributed to the making of the Columbine High School massacre, a violent reality staged to look like a Hollywood film and strategically orchestrated to make use of the media spectacle. In 2004, I began work on a project called Nothing Much Happened Today. Nothing Much Happened Today is a 32-inch by 40-inch counted cross stitch. I used a computer program to translate each pixel of the iconic surveillance still from the Columbine High School massacre into the nearest color embroidery floss, then hand-stitched the 480,000 pixels. There's a story told that on the day that the Revolutionary War began, the King of England, George III, wrote only one sentence in his journal: "Nothing much happened today." For him, that day would not gain significance for many, many months. The process of counted cross-stitch is slow, calculated, handmade, and personal, in contrast to the liberal, messy, disposable, and somewhat objective character of surveillance video. The obsessive act of making can be seen as a physical digestion of the image, one pixel at a time, a 5,000-hour penance, or a way of taking ownership over the image. The time code is evidence of a 1/30th of a second, a photo taken in an almost instantaneous and objective manner. Minutes later, this 1/30th of a second had become the iconic image of an event. It is through images that these events stick so profoundly in our minds. Nothing Much Happens Today calls into question the speed of which we now receive information, especially visual information about traumatic events and the feedback loop of spectacle in which the media plays an integral part. I would argue that screen-based visual images make us vulnerable to manipulation, denying us the time, space, and ability to process the images we are bombarded with, and that our socially isolated experience with these images makes us even more vulnerable to that manipulation. Love Letters is a work that includes over 437 individually embroidered vintage handkerchiefs held to the wall with handmade porcelain pushpins that record the journals, essays, poems, lists, and fragments of text taken into evidence that was handwritten either by Dylan Klebold or Eric Harris, leading up to the Columbine High School massacre. Handkerchiefs have many practical and symbolic uses, often associated with grieving, rites of passage, secret messages, or bandaging of wounds, blood, sweat, snot, and tears, the weaknesses of the body too embarrassing to show in public. Harris and Klebold's writing tell of a preparation for event, not unlike a wedding, with seating arrangements, floor plans, drawings of shoes, coats, and accessories, to-do lists, and love poems mixed in among confessions, angry rants, napalm recipes, instructions for bombs, screenplays, bucket lists, apologies, and plans for a post-high school future. Scribbles of nonsense in the margins of a notebook now exist forever in a Department of Justice databank. These handkerchiefs also speak of cultural rites of passage, rites which have been nearly obliterated in contemporary culture. Love Letters details the failings of a society to embrace masculinity in any form other than desperate exhibitions of power and violence. In addition, Boys on Film includes sculptures made of a combination of porcelain and found objects. This work, The Killer in Me is the Killer in You, is a set of cast hybrid school desks and and gas torches. The eternal flames are a nod to the perpetual nature of these school shootings and the way they are frozen in time. Their polarizing effects making them nearly impossible to address. Through proximity, craft, and scale, the work in Boys on Film intends to provoke a re-examination of the forensics surrounding the Columbine High School massacre as a case study in American culture, particularly in regards to mental health, institutionalization, and ritual violence. Another such body of work is called Drawing from Observation and focuses on the imagery associated with the Rodney King beating. To deal with the perpetuation of violence against Black men by police officers and more broadly the justice system. This body of work includes a series of stitcheries and stills from the Rodney King beating called Reversed Racism. The work evokes Rodney King in order to speak about the perpetuation of a problem which first came to the attention of much of white America in 1991, and of which little has been done since George Holliday captured these images on videotape. The images in this series are reversed, suggesting a rewinding and replaying of history over and over. Several of the stitcheries in the series focus on blurs in the tape as the camera itself seems to not be able to process what it is viewing. Drawing from Observation also includes a series of sculptures and performances. In Who Draws Your Veil Across the Stars, broken chandeliers are used to create an installation. Each chandelier's arm holds a light which still burns bright despite their broken frames. The viewer is encouraged to walk among the broken chandeliers, hanging from the ceiling and laying on the ground, pieces strewn asunder. The installation is accompanied by a sound work made from 3 distinct pieces of Americana, all of which reference the dream of an unfilled American promise. Audio recordings of the Apollo 11 moon landing, James Earl Jones reading the Langston Hughes poem, Let America Be America Again, and the Sun Ra arrangement of Somewhere Over the Rainbow. All 3 bear within them the ideological American dream and the dialectical desire for escapism from an America which continues to fail its promise. The performance and installation, I Have Loved the Stars Too Fondly to Be Fearful of the Night, further expands on this material and physical elements of the George Holliday videotape. The work is an installation that was made for a gallery in Los Angeles and uses Police Maglite brand flashlights to create a room of constellations. The constellations are those associated with the hunter Orion and his dogs, Canis Major and Minor. In one corner of the room, I hired an LAPD officer and K9 to stand in the shadows. This installation considers the aesthetics of power, including the power of vision, that a flashlight can give or take away, and puts gallery attendees into uncomfortable proximity with officer and dog. In Night Each Night Comes Nightly, I use police batons that have been cast out of porcelain and filled with bone ash to strike the walls of a gallery that has been painted black. Each strike has been lit with the Maglite. The performance video, which was lit by a single Maglite, can be seen viewed in a small screen outside the space. What is left for the viewer is only the aftermath, the residue where the literal dust has settled. In this work, the walls become a space for drawing, reminiscent of cave drawings. The light directly pointed at the viewer gives a sense of self-consciousness that someone or something is watching you. All these works intend to expand a photographic experience into a tactile sculptural one, disallowing the viewer to separate themselves from the subject of the image on which they are based. So the work that I've been working on most recently actually started in 2006. So a lot of these things like kind of grow out rhizomatically, right? Like a project sort of gets started and it gets revisited over periods of time, sort of depending on what comes up for me sometimes. But this has become, the body work known as X-ray vision versus invisibility has really become the kind of work that I've been working on, I guess, most recently in the most regular way. So the dialectic of seeing and being seen is central to my work. The sense of sight gives us a powerful mechanism for apprehending the world, but vision is shaped by desire and often blinds us to what we see. Invisibility offers something different, both the freedom from being counted, controlled, and labeled, and the powerlessness of not being recorded, of not having the recognition one needs to be regarded as a full political subject. What embodied meaning is conveyed by the object, the objects that silently mediate immaterial images. And how does this form of mediating object alter our relation to the content? This question is central to the work in X-ray vision versus invisibility, where I remediate images from digital to analog with varying degrees of manipulation. I use remediation to translate digital images into tangible, singular objects to destabilize the viewer's relationship with the flatness of images and to add concrete tactility to otherwise transient and immaterial things. Sometimes this change is subtle, such as a faithful copy replicated in counted cross-stitch or cyanotype, as seen here. Other times, an image or detail is expanded into a sculptural object or mural-sized installation. I'm preoccupied with changing the medium, scale, or temporal experience of an image to produce a fracture or fissure that allows the historical construction of the image and viewer's desire to become evident. What is our relationship to the content of these images outside of the screen? And how do our image machines reinforce psychological borders? The work in X-ray vision versus invisibility responds to the centrality of sight informing frameworks for Western knowledge production, and asks the questions, what is excluded when vision is the primary metaphor for understanding? Fatigued with digital life, craft has had a major resurgence inside and outside of the art world. X-ray vision versus invisibility cross-pollinates craft-coded mediums with the instantaneous images that machines produce to highlight the constructed and aestheticized nature of these images. Persuasive source images and explore the phenomenological effects of machine vision technologies on the perception of undocumented immigrants crossing international borders. This body of work currently includes 4 related projects: Backscatter Blueprint, Quilting Point, Valley of Shadows, and Ground Control, all of which remediate digital images made by machine vision technologies into historic craft processes to explore how subtle changes in form affect the content of the images. Reproducing machine vision imagery intended for digital screen-based viewing using analog historical processes developed at the beginning of the modern period asks us to consider the precedent for digital image making, which was developed from Western Enlightenment vision technologies that began with perspectival drawing and optical devices such as the camera obscura. The architectural grid was integral to the development of perspectival drawing that revolutionized painting in the early 1400s and opened the way for the mimetic styles of Renaissance art that followed, which used a grid to describe space and facilitate the illusion of depth. This Dürer etching shows the artist at work with the assistance of a physical grid placed between himself and his subject to aid in creating the illusion of depth associated with perspectival space. In the mid-19th century, the grid was moved behind the subject of study to flatten the image in the service of supposed scientific objectivity as a means of categorizing the physical differences among colonized people. The grid would become a central motif in modernism as the relationship between figure and ground and the illusionistic space associated with it began to collapse, culminating in minimalism's preoccupation instead with surface, structure, and phenomenological effects. The grid is a central motif throughout the work in X-ray vision versus invisibility. It is most dramatically apparent in the Backscatter Blueprint wall installations, and is the constitutive element in both the counted cross-stitch works that make up Quilting Point and the series of Gobelin tapestries which make up Ground Control. These hand-embroidered and woven works of machine vision images are entirely structured by the grid, where cotton or wool thread are slowly built over the warp of an even weave fabric or upright tapestry loom. The X-ray's ability to see through the trucks in both Backscatter Blueprint and Quilting Point reveals an architectural grid that is not superimposed in front or behind, but instead is joined in the image with the bodies of the people being smuggled in the same plane. Akira Lippitt notes in his book Atomic Light that with the apparatus of the X-ray, the subject was forced to concede the limits of the body, erasing the delineation between outside and inside. Everything becomes flat and creates interior and exterior as one. The force of the surface to delineate, to produce a limit and therefore meaning in the world has collapsed. This collapsing of interior and exterior space is evident in architectural drawings from many centuries before the X-ray and posit an invasive type of control executed through the power of vision. This is what in some ways is visualized in the project X-ray vision versus invisibility, the flattening of our own political and social and economic lives under surveillance capitalism. The conflation of commodity and human relations as seen by machines, for the purpose of regulating and controlling national borders that maintain the neo-colonial relations necessary for the continuation of global capital. Quilting Point was the first series in X-ray vision versus invisibility project. It began in 2006 and includes 12 stitcheries, completed over the next 10 years. Both backscatter imagery and infrared imagery are addressed in this series, mediums that will get their own individual treatments in Backscatter Blueprint and Valley of Shadows. This translation of the image from near instantaneous creation to time-intensive medium of embroidery alters the physical and psychological space between viewer and picture. The visible labor time is the evidence of a careful cathexis or concentration of emotional investment on the part of the maker, which is meant to distinguish itself from the way these machine visions are often used in popular culture as evidential documents whose highly abstract and emotionally manipulative aesthetic quality is accepted as indexical truth, often going without comment or investigation. By separating these images from their screens, they're given a tactile body and physical space to be viewed outside of their original context. The direct light projected into the eye of the viewer by the computer screen is replaced by a soft, reflected light bouncing off their tiny peaks and valleys of the surface of the cross-stitch. Reproducing these reified images generated by machine vision as handmade one-of-a-kind objects is meant to reveal the seemingly authorless authority of surveillance imagery as a constructed aesthetic with an alienating effect. The soft, carefully placed cotton cross-stitches imbues these images with a warm, deliberate human quality the digital source lacks. The growing availability of backscatter images and desire to dramatically shift scale led to the work in Backscatter Blueprint, which focuses on remediating images taken exclusively by backscatter X-ray machines into the 19th century process of cyanotype. I became aware of backscatter technology in 2005 when the controversial technology was being tested as a cutting-edge tool in airport security. Although they have been mostly replaced by millimeter wave scanners in airports, backscatter machines have become widely used on by border control and government agencies around the world to inspect randomly selected trucks, cars, and containers to expose the smuggling of both human and contraband cargo. Invented in 1842, cyanotype is made by brushing a light-sensitive mixture of ferric ammonium citrate and potassium ferrocyanide onto a substrate which creates a negative image when exposed to UV light. The pages you see here are from the first book illustrated with photographic images. Originally intended for the Manual of British Marine Algae, these images demonstrate the use of the medium as part of the Enlightenment project of scientific categorization of the natural world. The cyanotype process is most widely known for its use in architectural renderings, eliminating the cumbersome expense of hand tracing architectural plans. By the 1890s, it was the industry standard and remained so for the first half of the 20th century. The ubiquitous grid of these plans is echoed in every part of my project and is intended to critique the overdetermined use of the grid to organize and structure the visual field. The optical techniques once used to advance artistic mimesis have gone beyond the limits of human vision. The pictures made by the backscatter machine collapse the formal qualities of Anna Atkins' translucent images and the architectural elevations, revealing a jarring tension between the rationalized mechanical grids of the trucks and the fragile shadows of their human cargo, whose skins become translucent under the look of the X-ray machine, much like the Atkins early botanical specimens. The grid of the larger works in Backscatter Blueprint is accentuated by the liveness and memory of the paper it is printed on. Made up entirely of 17 by 22-inch tiled panels, the paper size is known as ANSIC, a reference to the American National Standards Institute, which regulates standard office paper sizes. The hundreds of push pins that hold the paper to the wall are all handmade from porcelain. a detail intended to punctuate the reference to the way our lives are precariously structured through bureaucratic agencies. The segmentation fractures the image, highlighting the photograph as a construction, an allusion to the ubiquitous bulletin board found in the claustrophobic, highly regulated bureaucratic spaces that mediate from a distance the often wild and open spaces associated with the border. The scale that is achieved through the segmentation is the greatest departure from the original screen image and serves to engulf the viewer's field of vision, which produces a sense of entry into the tableau that is simultaneously refuted by the distancing effect of the paper's movement and segmentation. The scale is an intentional reference to the mural form popularized in Mexico in the early 20th century, which mixed Renaissance composition and modeling with modernist abstraction. Valley of Shadows continues the exploration of 19th century photographic techniques to remediate night vision images taken by thermal infrared cameras. In this series, I rephotograph appropriated images sourced from the Border Patrol, vigilante websites, and refugees and migrants crossing the border into the United States using the process of wet plate collodion tintype. The wet collodion tintype is a photographic technique invented in 1851. Process involves coating a plate with a solution and sensitizing it with silver nitrate. While still wet, the 8x10 plate is placed in a film holder and into the back of a camera, which is pointed at my computer screen only a few feet away from the lens. The brightness of the screen exposes the plate directly. Compared to other photographic processes at the time, the inexpensive and portable nature of wet plate collodion made it a favored medium of the early photographers of the American West, who used it both to document and to advertise 19th century American migration westward. The use of collodion transforms infrared surveillance images into unique objects that resemble early photographs of the American West. In so doing, the migrants and refugees of today become a visual reverberation of the American migrations of another era. The translation from digital to historic photographic processes in both Backscatter Blueprint and Valley of Shadows is intended to show how new machine vision technologies often recycle older modes of viewing, and in so doing, reinforce the neo-colonial worldview historically embedded in digital imaging. Backscatter and infrared machines extend our sense of sight beyond the mimetic limits of linear perspective to include superhuman abilities such as night vision and X-ray vision, for the most part along the horizontal X and Y axis. The fourth series in X-ray vision versus invisibility examines the Z-axis of Cartesian space, the aerial view. The image you see here is of an architectural drawing of a house that dates back to ancient Mesopotamia and imagines a conflation of interior and exterior spaces. The ability to see through walls and organize space from an overhead position over 1,000 years before the invention of the Cartesian coordinates. Satellite images are a direct descendant of this ancient technology of organizing space from an aerial view and are the subject of the work in ground control. The thermal emissions radiometer images used in this project are collected by satellites and used for remote sensing of the Earth's surface. Unlike backscatter and infrared technology, this extends the abilities of the human eye in a way that approximates human, this extends the abilities of the human eye in a way that approximate human sight. Remote sensing collects the data and constructs images through a process entirely outside human perception. Without visualization, remote sensing exists as largely unintelligible data set. The false color that is assigned to the data set produces the otherworldly abstractions that make the images both legible and aesthetically seductive. The tapestries in ground control are then woven by hand over a period of 1 or 2 years by the Taller Mexicano de Gobelinos in exchange for the amount of money it costs a family of 4 to be smuggled across the US-Mexico border at the time of production. The cost determines the size of the tapestry produced. This atelier was selected both for its location in Mexico as well as for the expertise of the weavers in Gobelin tapestry, a craft that was developed for the French monarchy in the 1500s to copy paintings and can only be produced by hand. The labor which is required to produce hand-woven tapestries made them exclusive during the Renaissance and nearly extinct after the invention of the first mechanized looms, which ushered in the Industrial Revolution and were some of the first inventions to implement digital punch cards. Ground control exists at this intersection between digital surveillance technologies and the history of global capitalism, and the way in which our desire for images and the desire for mastery by way of image making has functioned both to facilitate and as an engine of the colonial project. By translating remote sensed images from a digital screen-based medium into handmade wool tapestries, then exhibited on the floor, ground control reconnects the abstracted image of the earth with the earth itself, and with an embodied presence that engages with the viewer in tactile, visual, and performative ways. Using various craft-driven processes to remediate machine images into tactile, unique, and fragile objects, the work presented in X-ray vision versus invisibility embodies the contradictions that the source images disavow. While aesthetically transforming our world, the phantasmagorical images of today carry with them the relics of history and a demand for reasoning and clarity, which distorts the world in accordance with these desires, expanding, stretching, accelerating, freezing, and collapsing time and space. This history is hidden behind the glittering spectacle and speed of the new, the speed of vision. My work brings images back to the temporal space of the body. Thank you.